Hello friends, I'm Abraham Lincoln. Welcome to another chapter of Historical Impact, Private Lives, where we not only recount and analyze historical events, but also aim to provide a space for reflection and usefulness for your lives. Thank you for joining us. Today we will talk about Prohibition in the United States of America. Prohibition, as you all know, refers to the prohibition of selling alcoholic beverages that was in effect in the United States between 1920 and 1933. There are many myths about this issue, even among well-informed individuals who sometimes miss what really happened with Prohibition. To begin, we'll point out some misconceptions. First, it is said that Prohibition was introduced by a group of conservatives who disliked alcohol. This is false. Second, the entire population of the United States immediately headed to speakeasies and drank more than double. This is false. Third, all of this had the unforeseeable consequence of the country falling into the hands of Al Capone. This is also false. Fourth, in 1933, everyone decided that Prohibition made no sense for moral reasons and it was repealed. Another falsehood. In reality, Prohibition did not happen solely at the instigation of a movement of conservative citizens, although there were many who could be classified as conservative practically from the birth of the nation. But this is not directly linked to the establishment of alcohol prohibition. The causes, as almost always in life, are a bit more complex, and that's what we'll analyze here. In reality, the anti-alcohol movement was filled with progressives who believed it would help the American nation progress towards a new state of sobriety. To the original conservative movement, various liberal intellectuals joined, as well as political left-wing union leaders of the time, who condemned alcohol consumption as a provoking element of backwardness and poverty among what was called the working class. They said that alcohol consumption caused various diseases, such as dementia, and also stimulated crime. During Prohibition, feminist movements also participated, opposing the bars and salons culture that emerged from it. Women couldn't go to the taverns. They were at home, impoverished and in mortal fear. Especially in the western United States, there was a popular perception that husbands would collect their wages and go to bars, spending everything and returning home furious, penniless, and sometimes resorting to violence against their wives. During that time, novels and plays were written on the subject. 10 Nights in a Barroom, written by Timothy Shea Arthur, was the second best-selling novel after Uncle Tom's Cabin. These novels depicted the bars of the time as infamous temptresses that seduced men to enter. Once there, they were led down an inevitable path of alcoholism, violence, poverty, and death. Even the drunks in the novel 10 Nights in a Barroom were in favor of Prohibition. Carrie Nation intervened during this time, leading the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This group had the practice of entering bars and outside of them, and destroying any bottles of alcohol they found on their path. They used hatchets for this, which later became a symbol of their crusade against alcohol. On the path leading to the establishment of Prohibition, three main groups were distinguished. The dries, who were abstainers who wanted Prohibition. The wets, who were against Prohibition. The dry drinkers, who were drinkers who believed that others shouldn't do so, not themselves. And thus began the conflicts between these different groups. Those against Prohibition were primarily German immigrants because they owned all the breweries of the time. The Germans living in the United States at that time had no tradition of abstinence or moderation. They earned a lot of money, which they in turn invested in advertising campaigns against the dries. The advertisements pushed by these groups portrayed beer as the healthy German drink, opposed to whiskey, which according to this group of Germans, was what should be prohibited. But then came the First World War, and chauvinistic propaganda erupted. Then, the friendly Germans became the enemy. It began to be said that beer was produced by enemy immigrants of the United States, and these German companies began to be completely discredited. We mentioned at the beginning of this story that Prohibition began in 1920, and we also said that women had a tough time with their drunken husbands. Do you know when women's suffrage began in the United States? Precisely in 1920. With the arrival of women's suffrage, goodbye alcohol. The politicians who supported Prohibition at that time won and occupied many seats as representatives. Prohibition had two parts. There was the constitutional amendment, and there was the legislator Andrew Volstead's Act. Known as the Volstead Act, which came to develop the 18th Amendment, on which it was determined to prohibit the sale, importation, and manufacture of alcoholic beverages throughout the territory of the United States of America. The so-called Volstead Act defined intoxicants primarily as anything with a graduation higher than 5%. It was then that a political earthquake occurred, and the law was vetoed by then-President Woodrow Wilson. And the veto, in turn, was overturned by Congress, and the law was enacted. Senator Volstead said the following:
"Tonight, a new nation will be born. The demon of drink makes its will. From this moment on, a time of clear ideas and clean manners begins. The slums will soon be a thing of the past. Prisons and correctional facilities will be empty. We will turn them into barns and factories. All men will walk tall again. All women will smile, and all children will laugh. The gates of hell will be closed forever."
The biggest myth of Prohibition is that alcohol consumption increased, and in reality, this was not the case. Alcohol consumption dropped by half, although alcohol consumption did increase in some places, like New York. In this city, 10,000 illegal alcohol selling sites were opened. The chronicles of the time detailed the sensation that everyone was in clandestine taverns, writing novels while Scott Fitzgerald wrote and George Gershwin played the piano. But it wasn't the case in Wyoming, for example, one of the rural areas of the United States. In the small towns of the American Midwest, the bars had simply closed. In a small town, there were no alleys to hide from the police or hidden places to set up a clandestine bar. In some places, some people set up homemade distilleries in remote locations, and smugglers made occasional deliveries of the worst imaginable. In an incident in Wichita, Kansas, a batch of questionable quality liquor left more than 500 people disabled in a single day. In cities, Prohibition worked very differently. Police forces began to receive bribes. In Boston, for example, there were 4 clandestine taverns on the same block as the police station. Charles Fitzmaurice, who was the chief of police in Chicago in the 1920s, said, "60% of my police officers are linked to alcohol trafficking." Many of the most serious crimes of the 1920s were directly the result of the clandestine alcohol business. Al Capone came to have a lot of power over the city of Chicago. But we'll leave that for another installment of our channel Historical Impact, Private Lives, where we'll develop the life of Alfonso Capone, the mafia boss of the time. Don't miss that chapter. That's why we invite you to subscribe to this channel. It doesn't cost much, it's just moving a finger. Returning to the story, a clandestine bar, back then, could simply be someone's apartment. That was usually the case. Italians owned a large number of apartments that were intended for drinking. To get a drink, people even went to neighborhoods with a majority of African American residents. The main black newspaper in New York, a columnist observed, and I'll quote part of the article verbatim, that in 10 years, speakeasies that flouted Prohibition had done more to improve race relations than black and white churches had in 10 decades. Clandestine bars proposed a new way of drinking. The most surprising result was that women could now go to a speakeasy. One of these bars once put up a sign that read, "Behind this door faint the most beautiful women in the world." The easiest liquor to make at home, back then, was gin, which used low-quality alcohol. A large quantity of this beverage was made with stolen industrial alcohol, and many people became ill from consuming it. The most significant and lasting consequence of Prohibition was that it destroyed the alcohol industry in the United States of America. Producing good wine, whiskey, and beer would take many years. It requires specialized equipment operated by skilled individuals. In the United States of America, for 13 years, there were no breweries or wineries. What existed were criminals mixing poison in dirty bathtubs, and artisanal sellers were desperate, and many had left the country or simply sought other work. There was no work for them, even if they were willing to work for mobsters. They didn't have the equipment or materials, so nothing good could come of it. A sophisticated industry was simply eliminated. When the law was repealed in 1933, most people hadn't had a decent drink in 13 years. They couldn't remember what a quality beer tasted like. For the next 50 years, the United States gained an unfortunate reputation for producing low-quality beer, dubious wine, and unpleasant rye whiskey. It is important to note that Prohibition did not end because people wanted to drink. It ended because people needed jobs. The crisis of 1930 ruined the economy of the United States, and they could no longer afford the luxury of prohibiting businesses that could provide jobs for many people in need. When Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency, beverage manufacturing resumed, and thousands of workers got their jobs back. But at one point, Prohibition won. The typical saloon of the pre-Prohibition era never returned. That pattern of behavior had been destroyed. Per capita consumption did not return to pre-Prohibition levels until the 1970s. In 1939, 43% of Americans were teetotalers. In conclusion, we could point out that Prohibition did not really end in 1933, and there are still some counties where the dry law persists. Taking advantage of the enthusiasm that this story surely generated, let's add some curiosities that arise from this history. During Prohibition, commercial wine production was prohibited, but the sale of grape juice was not prevented, which was sold in the form of semi-solid bricks and ended up being used for homemade wine production. Although the manufacturers indicated on the packaging that customers should prevent the fermentation of the juice to avoid breaking the law, imagine that many precisely began to ferment wine in their own homes. Prohibition had to consider exceptions, such as the religious use of wine for the Eucharist ritual and Jewish Sabbath rituals. Then, you could see recognized agnostics going to drink at churches or temples. Hollow canes were also started to be used, which were filled with alcohol to drink discreetly. These are small curiosities of Prohibition. But also, dear friends, I would like to just pose some questions, of which I do not dare to give answers at this moment. But perhaps, by that Socratic principle of the importance of the question, perhaps it will motivate some of you to some intimate, particular, and very personal reflection, which we will leave to the consideration of each of you. Do prohibitions as such represent a necessity for coexistence in society, or are they mere opportunistic obstacles of occasional interests? It is known that the human condition tends to see prohibited things as limitations, and popular inventiveness tends to create mechanisms to bypass rules. But is this right or wrong? Every restriction implies a limitation on human behavior, and perhaps the first thing that comes to mind is to think and feel that this goes against our rights and individual freedoms. At this point, I dare to resort to the principle of the philosophy of law that says that every right carries an obligation. And this surely leads us to a deeper instance of analysis, which we will not enter into at this opportunity, which is, what is the measure of what we call freedom? Putting practical examples that adorn our daily lives today. What would become of a city without traffic lights? What would it be like if there were no limitations on the circulation of pedestrians and vehicles in specific areas? What would become of properties that had no limits determining where a property right begins or ends? And what would it be like if there were no penalties determining that those rights and obligations were not fulfilled? Regarding the prohibition, it was a limitation of rights that marked a society, a culture, some customs. Perhaps the original intentions responded to valid concerns of those who promoted it, and in turn, they went against others. And here we start thinking about how interests, motivations, and the feeling of power play. As we said, we do not aim to answer these questions, which may be very minor for some, and even useless to ask. But we leave one last question. Could it be that the truly valid limit is the one dictated by our conscience? In other words, could it be that moral value, understood as those limits that we set for ourselves and comply with beyond our occasional conveniences, is the germ of bonds that add value to the human condition? What happens if you find someone's wallet has fallen, and this person is unaware? Moreover, no one else has noticed except you. Do you return it to the person who dropped it, or keep it? Why return it, or why keep it? Surely, that will be dictated by your conscience, by your own law. Here we recall the definition given by the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset, when he makes a distinction between what he defines as the mass man, who dilutes himself in the crowd, renounces his individuality, and seeks comfort and absolute equality, thus lacking a personality of his own. And in his work, The Revolt of the Masses, he opposes this definition to the man who is willing to submit to higher instances, which are determined by his ability to self-critique and reflect on his intrinsic value as the architect of his own destiny. We leave these ideas of Ortega for you to process in your intimacy. Sometimes, everything can be very relative, and perhaps other times, nothing should be relative. Everything will depend on how much we value our human condition, our brief passage through these earthly valleys. Knowing that learning is continuous and surely never ends. What never ends is your continued support on this humble channel. Subscribe. You already know. We don't need to tell you. We just thank you once again for supporting us. Abraham Lincoln bids you farewell.